The wrinkled divorce papers felt like lead in Naomi Bennett's trembling hands. 8 years. 8 years of pouring her soul into a home that was never truly hers. 8 years of bowing, of silencing her own voice, and of enduring the clinical, icy stares of the Park family. Every failed treatment, every negative test, and every hushed whisper in the hallways of the Park mansion had led to this moment of absolute disposal. "You have 60 minutes," her mother-in-law's voice cut through the silence, sharp and jagged as shards of ice. She stood in the center of the grand foyer, the very picture of Gangnam elitist cruelty. "The security team will oversee your exit. You will take nothing that was bought with Park money." Naomi's throat constricted, her voice barely a thread. "Seung-ho, where am I supposed to go? I gave up my country for you." "That," the older woman snapped, "is a consequence of your own failure. You trapped my son in a barren, useless marriage for nearly a decade. You are a foreigner. You were an experiment that failed to produce an heir. Your presence is no longer an embarrassment we are willing to tolerate." The words struck with the force of a physical blow. Naomi looked toward the corner of the room, searching for the man who had once promised to be her world. Park Seung-ho stood there, his silhouette rigid, his gaze fixed firmly on the marble floor. "Are you really going to let her do this?" Naomi whispered, a single tear escaping. 8 years, Seung-ho, was it all a lie? When he finally looked up, his eyes were hollow, stripped of the warmth they once held. "My mother is right, Naomi. I need a legacy. I need a son. You've had 8 years to give me what matters most, and you couldn't. This marriage was a waste of time." Something deep inside Naomi, the last flickering ember of the woman she used to be, finally shattered. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She simply wiped her eyes and straightened her spine, the beige of her soft cardigan a stark contrast to the cold, dark stone of the mansion. "Fine," she said, her voice turning as cold as the soul winter. "I'll leave, but I am taking my mother's necklace and the passport you tried so hard to make me forget." "You'll leave with the clothes on your back," the mother-in-law hissed. "And you should be grateful we aren't calling immigration to have you deported tonight." Naomi walked upstairs one last time, past the bedroom that had become her silent prison. She packed a single, small bag, only the items that belonged to the woman she was before the Park family eroded her. When she returned downstairs, 2 security guards were waiting. They marched her past the sprawling gardens and through the towering iron gates. The gates hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a prison sentence. Then the sky broke. The soul downpour was relentless, a cold, gray curtain that soaked through her clothes in seconds. Naomi collapsed onto the wet sidewalk, the divorce papers turning to pulp in her lap. She was a ghost in a city that had chewed her up and spat her out. 8 years of her life gone. She was at her absolute zero until the headlights of a black Mercedes S-Class cut through the gloom. The car didn't pass her. It stopped. The back door opened, and a man stepped out into the rain. He was broad-shouldered and imposing, his white shirt clinging to a muscular frame that radiated a quiet, dangerous authority. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her as if he were seeing a weapon that had simply been misplaced. Kang Yi-hyun, the man her husband feared most, stood over her. Without a word, he took off his tailored black suit jacket and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The warmth of the fabric was the first kindness she had felt in a decade. "Naomi Bennett," he said, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that commanded the very air around them. "Your time as a spectator is over. Get in the car. You're coming with me." "Hello, family. So happy to have you here. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story." The chill of the Seoul autumn rain was a relentless, biting weight that soaked through Naomi's beige cardigan until it felt like a second, heavier skin. She remained on the wet sidewalk, her posture slightly folded inward as she stared at the iron gates of the Park mansion. The metal bars had finally hissed shut, a sound that echoed the finality of the 8 years she had just lost to a family that viewed her as a broken experiment. In her lap, the divorce papers were already turning to gray pulp, the ink of Park Seung-ho's signature blurring into the grime of the street. She felt like a discarded doll, a foreigner who had made herself small for nearly a decade, only to be spat out into the dark. The sound of the rain was suddenly interrupted by the low, predatory purr of an engine. A black Mercedes S-Class, a vehicle that whispered of both immense wealth and calculated danger, pulled toward the curb. Naomi didn't look up at first. She was too drained, her survival instincts buried under a mountain of humiliation. It was only when the heavy back door opened that she sensed a shift in the air. A man stepped out into the downpour. He was tall and broad-shouldered, possessing a naturally dominant presence that seemed to command the very storm around him. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, now slightly damp, with the sleeves rolled back to reveal intricate black tattoos that coiled like snakes around his forearms and hands. This was Kang Yi-hyun, the legendary head of the city's most feared syndicate, and the one man her ex-husband's family spent their lives trying to avoid. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, nor did he offer words of hollow comfort. He stood over her, his sharp jawline and intense gaze projecting a quiet authority that was protective rather than threatening. Without a word, he reached into the car and pulled out his tailored black suit jacket, draping it over Naomi's shivering shoulders. The warmth of the fabric, smelling of expensive sandalwood and something darker, was the first kindness she had felt since the day she signed her life over to the Parks. "Naomi Bennett," he said, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that vibrated through the cold air. "Get in the car." "I don't know you," she whispered, her voice brittle and dry despite the rain. "I know you," Yi-hyun countered, his expression calm and absolute. "I know you spent 8 years playing the obedient daughter-in-law while they measured your worth in negative pregnancy tests. I know they threw you out like garbage 10 minutes ago because they think you're a notorious disappointment." Naomi finally met his eyes. They held an intensity that made her breath catch, a frightening intelligence that saw past her defeated posture. "I'm offering you a choice," he continued, his smile as sharp and precise as a knife. "You can sit on this pavement and wait for immigration to deport you, or you can get in this car and let me give you the one thing the Parks are truly afraid of: revenge." The word acted like a jolt of electricity to her frozen heart. Yi-hyun leaned closer, his magnetic presence overwhelming the scent of the rain. "I don't want a victim, Naomi. I need a weapon. Someone with a fire to help me destroy the family that tried to break her. I'm offering you a seat at my table and a plan for war." Naomi looked at the black tattoos on his hand, then back at the gates of the prison she had just escaped. The choice was between disappearing into nothingness or becoming something dangerous beside a man who saw her value. She stood up, her legs shaking but her spine finally beginning to straighten. She walked to the car and slid into the leather interior, the door closing behind her with a soft, heavy click that sounded like fate locking into place. Yi-hyun settled back into the seat beside her, his dark black hair swept back and his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Good," he murmured. "Tomorrow, the city will learn that you aren't broken. You're mine." The drive away from the Park mansion was a blur of neon lights and gray mist, the silence inside the Mercedes S-Class heavy with the scent of leather and Yi-hyun's expensive cologne. Naomi sat rigidly in the backseat, still wrapped in the Mafia boss's oversized suit jacket, its warmth the only thing keeping her from splintering into 1,000 pieces. She watched the city of Seoul streak past, the luxury stores and designer boutiques of Gangnam, a neighborhood that had been her prison for 8 long years, until they reached a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Yi-hyun's penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, a stark, modern cathedral that overlooked the kingdom he commanded. As they stepped inside, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city lights, but Naomi could only stare at the sheer scale of the space. It was angular, cold, and meticulously curated, furniture that looked like modern art and a kitchen larger than the bedroom she had shared with Seung-ho. There were no soft edges here, no place for a woman to hide or make herself small. "The master suite is through there," Yi-hyun said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that echoed off the glass. He didn't look back as he walked toward the windows, his posture upright and controlled, his rolled-up sleeves revealing the dark ink of his tattoos in the moonlight. "I have a separate apartment on the floor below. You will have complete freedom here, but in public, you will be by my side." Naomi found her way to the suite, her feet sinking into the thick, dark carpet. Waiting for her was a wardrobe that had been filled with a precision that bordered on lethal. Gone were the beige cardigans and neutral-toned rags she had worn to appease her mother-in-law's sense of modesty. In their place hung silks in emerald green, midnight blue, and blood-red garments designed not just to be worn, but to protect. She shed her rain-soaked clothes, letting the last 8 years fall to the floor in a heap of wet fabric. After a scalding shower that washed away the grit of the sidewalk, she reached for a silk slip in a deep, metallic charcoal. The fabric was cool and liquid against her skin, cinching her waist and highlighting a figure she had spent years trying to conceal. As she looked at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, the woman staring back looked like a stranger, someone expensive, powerful, and utterly untouchable. "You're remembering who you were," a voice said from the doorway. Yi Hyun stood there, leaning against the frame, his expression calm but his eyes carrying an intensity that made her pulse flutter. He didn't apologize for the intrusion. In his world, there were no locked doors. He walked toward her, the light catching the sharp jawline and defined cheekbones that gave him the look of a dangerous work of art. "The Parks tried to break you because they feared your fire," he murmured, his thumb brushing a damp curl away from her face. "They wanted a doll, but I need a partner, someone who can walk through the flames and not even blink." Naomi straightened her spine, the silk of her new attire feeling like a suit of armor. The fragile woman who had been thrown out in the rain was dead. In her place stood the queen of the underworld's greatest gamble. She met Yi Hyun's gaze, her expressive eyes no longer cast downward. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice finally steady. Yi Hyun smiled, a beautiful, terrible thing that promised both salvation and destruction. "Good, because tomorrow we begin the signatures. We make this lie the most powerful truth in Seoul." The morning arrived with a clinical white light that reflected off the glass walls of the penthouse, stripping away any lingering softness from the night before. There were no flowers, no traditional music, and no crowd of judging in-laws to witness the event. The ceremony was nothing more than a quiet, efficient exchange of signatures at a private registry office, a cold, legal binding of two strangers for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. Naomi felt a strange sense of clarity as she watched the clerk process the paperwork. This felt more honest than the elaborate, traditional wedding she had endured 8 years ago, where she had been treated like a decorative experiment for the Park family to display. As she held the pen, her hand didn't shake. The ink on the page felt like a seal on her old life, a final door closing on the woman who had spent nearly a decade apologizing for her own existence. Beside her, Kang Yi-hyun stood like a pillar of dark granite, his presence alone enough to make the government officials move with a frantic, stuttering speed. He didn't look at the documents with sentiment. He looked at them like a commander reviewing a strategic treaty. When the final document was signed, making her legally bound to the most dangerous man in Seoul, they stepped out into the quiet hallway. The air in the building felt thin, a stark contrast to the heavy, sandalwood-scented atmosphere of Yi-hyun's world. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable and his posture exuding a controlled authority that made the sterile environment feel suddenly small. He reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out a small velvet box. "This is yours," he said, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that echoed in the corridor. Inside was a wedding ring that redefined the concept of luxury. It was a platinum band holding a diamond so large and brilliant it looked almost obscene in its perfection. The stone caught the fluorescent lights of the hallway, shattering them into 1,000 jagged needles of light. It was a sharp, defiant contrast to the delicate, modest band Seung-ho's mother had chosen for her, a ring meant to keep her humble, small, and reminded of her place as a secondary citizen in the Park dynasty. That ring had been a leash. This one was a statement of war. Yi-hyun took her hand, his grip warm and firm, and slid the band onto her finger. The weight of the metal was substantial, a physical anchor to her new reality. "In the world you're entering, Naomi, people will look for your weaknesses first," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles with a deliberate, protective touch that sent a jolt of heat through her shivering frame. "This isn't just a piece of jewelry, it's your shield. It tells everyone in this city, from the boardrooms of Gangnam to the shadows of the docks, that you are untouchable because you belong to me." Naomi looked down at the diamond, then back at Yi-hyun. For the first time, she noticed a matching platinum band already resting on his own finger, the dark ink of the tattoos on his hand framing the metal. It was a silent vow of their shared conflict. She realized then that he wasn't just giving her protection. He was giving her his name as a weapon to wield against those who had called her barren and worthless. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kang," he said, his lips curving into a ghost of a smile that promised both a sanctuary and a storm. "You are now married to the man your ex-husband fears most. Use that fear. Wear it like the silk I gave you." The ride back to the penthouse was filled with a charged, electric silence. As the car moved through the streets of Seoul, Naomi watched her reflection in the darkened window. She looked expensive, powerful, and lethal. The fragile woman who had been thrown out in the rain was gone, replaced by a partner in a blood pact. She was no longer a notorious disappointment. She was a force being forged in the heart of the underworld. She looked at the ring, feeling its cold weight. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of the Park family's disappointment on her shoulders. Now, she carried the weight of Yi Hyun's power on her finger. It was a trade she would make 1,000 times over. She thought of Seung-ho, standing in that corner, unable to even look at her as his mother stripped her of her dignity. She thought of the silence that had defined her marriage. Yi Hyun's voice broke through her thoughts, grounding her in the present. "We have 2 weeks until the charity gala," he noted, his eyes scanning the city spread below like a kingdom they were about to conquer. 2 weeks to make sure the Park family realizes that, when they threw you away, they made the most expensive mistake of their lives. You will not just attend that gala, Naomi. You will own it. Naomi leaned back into the leather seat, the diamond on her finger glittering like a cold, vengeful star. "I know exactly where their bodies are buried, Yi Hyun," she whispered, her voice finally carrying the fire he had seen in her on that sidewalk. "I spent 8 years watching them. I know every secret, every bribe, and every lie they've used to build their legacy." Yi Hyun turned to her, a genuine spark of interest lighting his intense eyes. "Then, let's make sure they never see the sun again." The following 2 weeks within the glass-walled sanctuary of the penthouse were not spent in idle luxury, but in a calculated, intense transformation. Under Kang Yi Hyun's quiet but absolute authority, Naomi began the arduous process of unlearning 8 years of submissive silence. The habit of bowing her head when a man entered the room was the first to go, replaced by a steady, unwavering gaze that Yi Hyun demanded every time they spoke. He didn't want a servant. He wanted a queen who could stand beside him without flinching at the shadows he cast. He watched her with a focused intensity, his masculine presence a constant. Grounding force as he pushed her to reclaim the fire the Park family had nearly extinguished. "Stop looking at the floor, Naomi," he would murmur, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air in the library. "The floor has nothing to give you. The people in front of you, they are the ones who need to see that you are no longer afraid."
The Park family's empire is built on these hidden transfers. We can use this to dismantle it all.
In those long, shadowed evenings, Naomi moved from the role of a discarded wife to a strategic informant. She sat across from Yi Hyun, the heavy silk of her new wardrobe rustling as she began to meticulously dismantle the Park family's carefully curated image. For 8 years, she had been the invisible woman in the corner of their boardrooms and dinner parties, a foreigner they assumed understood nothing of their complex financial webs. They had been wrong. She had been a silent witness to every hushed conversation about offshore accounts, every bribe funneled through charitable foundations, and every desperate move Park Seung-ho made to cover his mounting losses. As she spoke, Yi Hyun leaned back in his leather chair, the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate tattoos that symbolized his own dangerous path to power. He listened with the predatory patience of a man who knew exactly when to strike. When she revealed the specific ledger codes, Seung-ho used to hide his 3 billion won embezzlement from the family's primary company. A dark, dangerous spark lit Yi Hyun's eyes. He wasn't just hearing gossip. He was receiving the coordinates for a total financial execution. "You've been a very observant ghost, Mrs. Kang," he noted, his thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw as he studied the documents she had helped him reconstruct. "They treated you like a broken ornament, never realizing you were the one holding the keys to their destruction." "I was never broken, Yi Hyun," Naomi replied, her voice finally carrying a resonance that didn't falter. "I was just waiting for someone to give me a reason to fight back." Yi Hyun stood and walked toward her, his dominant energy filling the space between them. He didn't reach for her with the fumbling desperation she had known in her previous marriage. His touch was deliberate and reverent. He placed a hand on the back of her chair, leaning down until his sharp features were inches from hers. "You are learning to roar, Naomi. By the time we walk into that gala, the Parks won't just regret throwing you away." They will realize that they handed their greatest enemy the only weapon capable of ending them. Naomi looked up at him, her expressive eyes reflecting the cold, brilliant light of the diamond on her finger. She felt the emotional erosion of the last decade being replaced by a resilient, lethal steel. She was no longer a spectator in her own life. Under the protection of the city's most dangerous man, she was becoming the architect of her own justice. The fear that had once paralyzed her was now a fuel, and as she looked at the man who had reclaimed her from the rain, she knew that the war they were about to start would be absolute. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a cathedral of excess, glittering with 1,000 crystals and the sharp, predatory scent of old money. For 8 long, suffocating years, Naomi had entered rooms exactly like this as a shadow, walking 3 steps behind Park Seung-ho. In those days, her eyes had been trained to fixate on the floor, a survival tactic to avoid the pitying glances of society wives and the icy, judgmental stares of her in-laws. She had been the foreign experiment, the wife who was tolerated only as long as she remained silent and productive. But tonight, the floor-to-ceiling mirrors reflected a woman who looked like she had been forged in a different, more dangerous world. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the fabric shimmering with every movement like the surface of a dark lake. The back was cut daringly low, revealing the elegant strength of her spine, a spine that no longer bowed for anyone. Beside her, Kang Yi-hyun was a force of nature in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of a weapon. His hand rested on the small of her back, the touch light but possessively firm, his rolled-up sleeves revealing just enough of the dark ink on his forearms to remind everyone in the room exactly who he was. As they stepped into the heart of the gala, the low hum of high society conversation died a sudden, stuttering death. The whispers rose like a tide, shocked speculations about the foreign woman on the arm of the city's most feared man. But Naomi didn't flinch. She met every gaze with a lethal, radiant smile, her fingers grazing the massive diamond on her left hand that served as her shield. She wasn't just attending the event, she was reclaiming the space that had once been her prison. They found the Park family near the champagne fountain, a circle of manufactured perfection that shattered the moment they saw her. Park Seung-ho's face didn't just go pale, it turned the color of ash, his drink nearly slipping from his nerveless fingers. He stood with a delicate, fragile young woman on his arm. The replacement his mother had undoubtedly vetted for her fertility, but his eyes were locked on Naomi, wide with a mixture of shock and a sudden, sharp regret. His mother stood beside him, her wine glass trembling in a hand that had once pointed Naomi toward the door with such cold finality. Naomi, Seung-ho's voice was a strangled wreck of its former arrogance, barely audible over the orchestral music. What? How is this possible? You were supposed to be gone. You were supposed to be on a plane. I was never gone, Seung-ho, Naomi replied, her voice sweet as poison and twice as deadly. She stepped closer, letting the light catch the emeralds at her throat and the defiant fire in her eyes. I simply moved into a house where the doors aren't locked and my value isn't measured in ultrasounds. It turns out that when you stop making yourself small for people who hate you, you actually start to grow. Yi-hyun leaned in, his lips brushing Naomi's ear in a gesture that was both an intimate comfort and a calculated power move. He then turned his intense, focused gaze toward Seung-ho, extending a hand that was never meant to be shaken. Congratulations on your divorce, Mr. Park, Yi-hyun murmured, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that seemed to command the very air around them. I truly have to thank you. If you hadn't been foolish enough to throw away something so precious, I never would have had the pleasure of making Naomi my wife. The revelation hit the Parks like a physical blow. Seung-ho's eyes darted from the glittering wedding ring on Naomi's finger to the matching platinum band on Yi-hyun's hand. The realization was a slow-motion car crash. Not only had his discarded wife married his most lethal business rival, but she had done so with a speed that suggested the Park family had never truly owned her soul. This is a scandal, the mother-in-law hissed, her voice cracking with a desperation she couldn't hide. You've only been out of our house for 2 weeks. Have you no shame? Shame is something I left on your doorstep, along with that beige cardigan you hated so much, Naomi countered, her eyes flashing with a light that made the older woman recoil. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that was intended only for the 3 of them. I know about the 3 billion won embezzlement, Seung-ho, I know about the offshore accounts and the gambling debts you tried to hide in my Barren shadow. And more importantly, my husband now owns the debt you used to cover it." The silence that followed was absolute, a void in the middle of the crowded ballroom. Seung-ho looked at Yi Hyun, seeing not just a rival, but the man who now held the leash to his entire family's future. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. As Yi Hyun guided Naomi away, his hand steady and supportive on her back, Naomi didn't look back. She felt the power of her transformation vibrating in her chest. She was no longer the woman who had been thrown out in the rain. She was the woman who had returned to burn the palace down, and the fire was only just beginning. The ride back from the Grand Hyatt was a charged, heavy silence that felt entirely different from the quiet of the past 2 weeks. Inside the darkened cabin of the Mercedes, the air was thick with the scent of adrenaline, expensive champagne, and the lingering heat of the confrontation with the Parks. Naomi sat close to the window, the emerald silk of her gown rustling softly, while Yi Hyun remained a dark, imposing silhouette beside her. He didn't speak, but his hand remained firmly on the seat near her thigh, a silent anchor in the wake of the storm they had just unleashed. When the elevator doors hissed open at the penthouse, the glass fortress felt different, less like a strategic headquarters and more like a private, isolated world. Yi Hyun didn't go to his separate apartment on the floor below. Instead, he followed Naomi into the library, the room where they had spent countless hours dissecting the Park family's financial sins. The fireplace was a low amber glow, casting long, flickering shadows against the mahogany shelves. Naomi turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that had nothing to do with revenge. "We did it," she whispered, her voice finally losing its lethal edge and softening into something raw. The look on Seung-ho's face, it should have been enough. It was what I wanted for 8 years. Yi Hyun crossed the room slowly, his presence overwhelming the space until he stood just inches away. He looked devastatingly handsome in the dim light, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, and his white sleeves still rolled up to reveal the tattoos that marked him as a man of the shadows. He didn't look at her like a business partner or a strategic weapon. His gaze was dark, focused, and heavy with a desperate intensity. "Was it enough, Naomi?" he asked, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that made her skin tingle. "Because watching you stand your ground tonight, watching you reclaim your fire, it wasn't just about the debt or the revenge for me anymore." Naomi felt the fake arrangement, the signatures, the diamond shield, the calculated performance, dissolving around them like salt in water. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they traced the sharp line of his jaw, the skin there warm and real. "This was supposed to be a deal," she murmured, her expressive eyes searching his for the truth. "A way to survive, a way to show them I wasn't broken." Yi Hyun caught her hand, his grip firm and deliberate, pressing her palm against his chest so she could feel the frantic, ragged beat of his heart. "I didn't choose you because you were broken, Naomi. I chose you because you were the only woman in the city strong enough to stand in the middle of a war and still hold your head high." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in a rare moment of vulnerability. "I want this to be real. I want you not as a weapon, but as my wife in every way that matters. I've spent years being cold and alone, but you make me want to stay in the light." The confession was a physical weight, more substantial than the diamond on her finger. Naomi realized that for the first time in nearly a decade, she wasn't being loved for what she could provide or for the legacy she could carry. She was being loved for her fire, her strength, and her survival. "It's not a deal anymore," she whispered, her fingers threading through his dark hair. "I love you, Yi Hyun, not because you saved me, but because you saw me when I was invisible." The tension that had been building since the night on the wet sidewalk finally snapped. Yi Hyun pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of sandalwood, heat, and an absolute, irrevocable promise. There was no more pretending, no more games, and no more shadows between them. In the heart of the library where they had planned a war, they had found the only thing worth fighting for, a home. The morning sun had barely touched the glass peaks of the Seoul skyline when the first wave of the park's desperation broke across the internet. Naomi woke not to the peaceful hum of the penthouse, but to the frantic vibration of her phone, a digital cacophony of notifications that signaled the start of a new, uglier war. The Park family had launched a calculated, vicious smear campaign, saturating every major gossip blog and news site with fabricated stories designed to strip Naomi of the dignity she had so recently reclaimed. Headlines screamed of a foreign gold digger who had allegedly trapped Seung-ho in a barren marriage for years, while systematically draining the family's accounts before vanishing with the help of a dangerous criminal element. Naomi stood in the center of the master's suite, her hands trembling as she read the poisonous lies that painted her as a thief and a fraud. After 8 years of making herself small, of learning their language and bowing to their whims, they were trying to rewrite her history as a narrative of greed. The most painful strike was a leaked interview from Seung-ho's mother, who sat in her opulent garden looking like a wounded martyr, tearfully claiming that they had only ever shown Naomi generosity, and that she had repaid them by forging checks and stealing family heirlooms before her shameless disappearance. "It isn't true," Naomi whispered, her voice brittle as she walked into the living room where Yi Hyun was already standing. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark tattoos that seemed to pulse with a lethal energy as he watched the news cycle unfold. "I never took a single one that wasn't mine. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and my mother's necklace." Yi Hyun turned to her, his sharp jawline set in a grim, immovable line. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man who had been waiting for his opponent to walk into a trap. "I know it isn't true, Naomi," he said, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that acted as an immediate anchor to her spiraling thoughts. "They think they can win by shouting the loudest in the court of public opinion. They forgot that I don't play by their rules." He picked up his phone and made a single, brief call in rapid Korean that Naomi could barely follow, his tone absolute and commanding. Within an hour, the counterstrike began. Yi Hyun didn't just deny the allegations. He detonated the Park family's entire public image. He authorized his legal team and digital investigators to release the very files Naomi had helped him organize. The hard, digital proof of Park Seung-ho's 3 billion won embezzlement from his own family's primary company. The narrative shifted with a violent, whiplash-inducing speed. As the public viewed the evidence of Seung-ho's massive gambling debts and the hotel receipts that proved his long-term infidelity, the Park's wounded martyr act disintegrated into a pile of ashes. The internet exploded not with judgment of the foreign wife, but with absolute revulsion toward a dynasty that had used a woman's supposed infertility to mask their own criminal rot. By noon, the Park family's primary business associates were publicly cutting ties, and Seung-ho's mother had disappeared from the public eye, her ice-cold disapproval replaced by the sudden, freezing reality of a criminal investigation. Yi Hyun walked over to Naomi, placing his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone with a protective, grounding touch. "The war is over, Naomi," he murmured, his intense eyes locking onto hers. "They tried to use your silence as a shield for their sins. Now the whole world knows that you were the only real thing in that house of lies." Naomi leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest as the weight of 8 years of fear finally began to lift. She had been the broken one for so long, but in the reflection of the penthouse glass, she saw a woman who had survived the fire and come out holding the match. "I thought I wanted them to suffer," she whispered, "but seeing them fall, it just feels like I can finally breathe." Yi Hyun pulled her closer, his arms a solid, warm fortress. "Breathe, Naomi. From now on, you never have to look back again."
Naomi, what's wrong?
Jaehyun, I feel so dizzy.
I've got you.
3 weeks after the fall of the Park Empire, the silence in the penthouse felt different. No longer the heavy, strategic quiet of a war room, but a soft, domestic peace that Naomi was still learning to trust. However, a new, unsettling sensation had begun to take hold of her body. It started as a faint dizziness in the mornings, and a sudden, inexplicable revulsion toward the smell of the sandalwood incense Yi Hyun favored. Naomi sat on the edge of the sprawling master bed, her face pale and her breath shallow, wondering if the delayed trauma of the last 8 years was finally manifesting as a physical collapse. She had been told for nearly a decade that she was broken, a woman whose body was a mistake and a waste of time. When the nausea struck with a violent, undeniable force, Naomi rushed to the bathroom, her hands trembling as she gripped the cold marble vanity. She stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, seeing the expressive eyes that Yi Hyun said held fire, but which now only held a flickering, terrified confusion. She had spent 8 years under the Park roof enduring endless doctors, invasive treatments, and the pitying looks of nurses who measured her worth in negative pregnancy tests. She had been convinced that her womb was a desert, a barren space that had brought embarrassment to her existence. Yi Hyun found her there, leaning against the doorframe with that controlled, protective energy that had become her sanctuary. He was dressed in a simple black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled back to reveal the dark ink on his forearms, but his intense gaze was softened by a rare, raw concern. He didn't ask if she was ill. He simply crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, his presence a solid fortress against the ghosts of her past. "I'm calling the doctor," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble. "It's just stress, Yi Hyun," Naomi whispered, her voice brittle. "My body is just tired of fighting."
The results are positive. You're pregnant.
Pregnant? Yes, congratulations.
But when the doctor arrived at the penthouse, the diagnosis was not exhaustion. After a brief examination and a stunned silence that felt like a lifetime, the doctor looked up from the test results with a gentle, disbelieving smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kang. You are 6 weeks pregnant." The world tilted on its axis. Naomi felt the words hit her like a physical blow, more powerful than any cruelty the Park family had ever leveled against her. "That's impossible," she choked out, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I've tried for 8 years. They told me I was barren. They told me I couldn't give them an heir." The doctor shook her head, her expression serious. "Sometimes extreme stress and a toxic environment act as a natural barrier. Your body wasn't broken, Naomi. It was simply protecting itself from a place where it never felt safe." Naomi looked at Yi Hyun, her vision blurring with tears she finally allowed to fall. He was standing by the window, his broad-shouldered frame rigid with shock. For the first time since she had met him, his calm, dominant mask had cracked. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy, and knelt before her. He took her hands, the diamond ring he had given her as a shield still glittering on her finger, and pressed a reverent kiss to her palms. "You were never the problem, Naomi," he whispered, his voice broken and thick with an emotion she had never seen in him. "They tried to make you believe you were less than a woman to hide their own rot, but you were just waiting for a home where you could finally bloom." The Barren label, the 8 years of humiliation, and the status of being a notorious disappointment she had been forced to carry were revealed as the Park's biggest, most monstrous lie. In the arms of the man who had seen her value when she was invisible, Naomi realized that she wasn't just a survivor of a war, she was a creator of life. The fire Yi Hyun had seen in her was now a warmth that would build a future they had both once thought impossible. As she leaned into him, the glass fortress around them finally felt like a true home. 5 years had passed since the night the autumn rain tried to wash Naomi Bennett away, but standing on the wraparound balcony of the Gangnam penthouse, the memory felt like a story belonging to a stranger. The Seoul's skyline glittered below her like a conquered kingdom of glass and light, no longer a prison, but a landscape she navigated with the absolute confidence of a woman who knew her worth. She wasn't the trembling figure in beige cardigans anymore. She was the woman who had taken over, a partner in an empire built on the ruins of the family that once called her a disappointment. The glass door behind her slid open with a soft, expensive hiss, and the steady, rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed against the stone. Kang Yi Hyun stepped into the cool night air, his presence as dominant and protective as the day he first draped his jacket over her shivering shoulders. He had traded his charcoal gala suit for a simple black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark tattoos that Grace, their 4-year-old daughter, loved to trace with her tiny fingers. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood beside Naomi, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that was now as much about affection as it was about possession. "She's finally asleep," Yi Hyun murmured, his voice a low, smoke-filled rumble that still had the power to make Naomi's heart stutter. "She insisted on wearing the silver bracelet her uncle sent. She thinks the engraving is a magic spell." Naomi smiled, looking down at her own hand, where the massive diamond shield still caught the city lights. The bracelet was a gift from Park Seung-ho, a pathetic silver olive branch sent from the shadow of the mediocre life he now lived. He had never recovered his family's prestige after the embezzlement was exposed, and his perfect replacement wife had left him the moment the money ran out. Naomi had kept the gift, not out of forgiveness, but as a reminder that the past was a ghost that could no longer haunt her. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the mutual understanding of two people who had seen the worst of the world and decided to build something better. Naomi looked out at the sprawling city, remembering how she used to feel like a guest in her own home, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid the wrath of a mother-in-law who saw her as a defect. Now, her name carried weight. When she walked into a room, it wasn't the sound of her heels that made people turn. It was the quiet, undeniable power she shared with the man beside her. "She has your fire, Yi Hyun," Naomi said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I saw her staring down the playground monitors today. She didn't bow once, not even when they told her she was being too loud." Yi Hyun laughed softly, a sound that was once rare but now filled the penthouse daily. He turned Naomi to face him, his intense gaze softening as it traveled over the woman she had become, beautiful, fierce, and utterly untouchable. "She has your strength, Naomi. She knows she is enough because she watches you every day. She knows that being loud is just another word for having a voice." He reached out, his thumb brushing against her jawline with a reverent touch. "I look at you sometimes, and I forget that there was ever a version of you that didn't know how to roar. You've built more in these 5 years than the Parks built in 3 generations." "I didn't do it alone," she whispered, her fingers threading through his. They stood together at the edge of the balcony, two survivors who had started a war for revenge and ended up finding a home. The barren foreigner who had been thrown out with the trash was gone, replaced by a queen who sat at the head of the city's most powerful table. As the wind brushed against them, Naomi looked out at the lights and finally understood that her life hadn't ended on that wet sidewalk. It had simply been waiting for the rain to stop, so she could finally see the empire she was meant to rule. The weight of the 8 years she had lost no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the foundation. Every insult, every cold look, and every moment of isolation had been the pressure required to turn her into the diamond she now wore. She was home, and for the first time in her life, she knew that no one, no matter how powerful, could ever throw her out again. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I loved you before the world knew your name," he replied, pulling her into the warmth of his arms as the city hummed a peaceful song below them.